new Mirage from Mitsubishi.
Mystery, missing, unsolved. Those are three of the favorite words of fiction writers. Good evening, I'm Ray Lovell, and the stories we'll present tonight are not fiction. They all happened here in Hawaii, and they all still end with a question mark. Now, one of Hawaii's oldest mysteries does not involve murder or any other crime. Instead, it begins in the year 1819 with a dying wish of Hawaii's first king, Kamehameha the Great.
During the time that he was very sick and old, he called all of his chiefs to come because he had to find at least trusted ones to hide his bones secretly.
Lydia Maioho is caretaker of the Royal Mausoleum in Nu'uanu and a descendant of Ho'olulu, one of the two chiefs Kamehameha had chosen to hide his bones. It was an ancient fear of Hawaii's ali'i that should an enemy discover their bones, that person could absorb their mana or power. But Lydia Maioho says her ancestor did leave one clue about where Kamehameha's bones are hidden.
And at that time, after the hiding of the bones, Ho'olulu and his brother, after the event was over and Ho'olulu had come back to his wife, they always said that Hawaiians named their child after an event. And when Ho'olulu returned to his wife, she had just given birth to a son. And he, Ho'olulu, named the son Kaihe'ekai, which meant the receding waters.
So perhaps in a seashore cave on the Big Island, where the entrance is visible only at low tide, the bones of Hawaii's first king remain undisturbed for almost 170 years. At any rate, the remains of Kamehameha the Great have never been found. And Lydia Maioho, like many other Hawaiians, believes the king's dying wish should still be honored, and that no one should even search for his bones. In a moment, we'll jump ahead in time to the year 1931, when the frightening story told by a young woman led to murder, and the territory of Hawaii almost lost its civilian government. When Hawaii's Unsolved Mysteries continues.
She went for a walk in Waikiki one summer night in 1931, but the shocking story she told about that night became the motive for a murder. And even the President of the United States got involved by demanding that the convicted killers be set free.
It was Saturday evening, September 12th. Thalia and her husband, Lieutenant Thomas Massie, had joined several other young Navy officers and their wives at a night spot called the Alawai Inn. It was here, beside the Alawai Canal, near where the Veterans of Foreign Wars clubhouse is now. Thalia was in a bad mood that night, so she decided to go for a walk alone. She crossed over the canal on the Kalakaua Avenue Bridge and then turned right onto Ina Road, or John Ina Road as it was known in those days.
Here where Ina Road makes a curve, she says a car pulled to the side, several young men jumped out, forced her inside, and then the car sped away toward Ala Moana.
The vehicle crossed the bridge over the Alawai Canal and headed toward town, passing Honolulu's smoldering garbage dump, which 3 years later would be transformed into Ala Moana Park, and a swampy area where nearly 3 decades later, Ala Moana Shopping Center would be built.
Finally, the car pulled off the road at the site of an abandoned airstrip and an old animal quarantine station. It was right over there where Ward Warehouse is today. Now, back in 1931, there were just some broken concrete slabs and thick brush. It was right over there that, in Thalia Massie's own words, something terrible happened.
It was a few minutes past 1 a.m. Sunday, September 13th, when she stumbled out to Ala Moana Road, flagged down a passing car, and through bruised and swollen lips mumbled her request that she be driven home. Thalia and her husband lived in this house in Manoa. When Thomas couldn't find his wife at the Alawai Inn that night, he drove home with another Navy officer, then phoned his house. Thalia answered and asked him to come home at once. When Thomas Massie saw his wife's battered, bloodied face, he called the police. Thalia Massie told the detectives who answered the call that her abductors beat her and took turns raping her. But she said the scene was so dark she would not be able to identify them, and she said she did not see the license plate of the car when it drove away. However, while she was being treated at Queens Hospital, a police car was parked just outside the open window of the emergency room. From its radio, the police dispatcher's voice could be heard describing a car carrying several young men that had been involved in a traffic incident. And the vehicle's license number, 58895, was repeated several times. An hour or so later, Thalia Massie gave police essentially the same description of the car involved in her abduction and its license number, which was only one numeral different from this one. Well, that led police to round up the 5 young men who had been in the car that night. And during the next few days, those suspects, David Takai, Horace Ida, Henry Chang, Benny Ahakuelo, and Joseph Kahahavai were paraded before Mrs. Massie on several occasions. Her memory continued to improve, and she began identifying the men as her attackers. Here in the Judiciary Building, they were put on trial for rape. But the jury members could not agree on their guilt or innocence, and a mistrial was declared. The jury's failure to convict the 5 men angered the Navy brass at Pearl Harbor and in Washington. Mainland newspapers ran editorials claiming white women were not safe in Honolulu. There were demands from the newspapers and some members of Congress that the military take over Hawaii's territorial government.
Meanwhile, rumors were circulating here in Honolulu that Thalia Massie was actually beaten by a lover, or even by her husband, who discovered she was having an affair with another Navy officer. Amid this background of rumors and tension, authorities here searched for new evidence for the retrial of the 5 men.
At this point, Thalia Massie's mother became a key player in the drama. Socialite Grace Fortescue came to Honolulu after learning of the attack on her daughter. She and Thalia's husband decided they could get the key evidence for the retrial by forcing a confession from one of the accused men. Their target was Joseph Kahahavai. With the help of 2 Navy enlisted men, Edward Lord and Albert Jones, they drew up a fake legal summons and served it on Kahahavai one morning as he was leaving the Judiciary Building. With the bogus document, they enticed him into a car and headed for Grace Fortescue's rented cottage in Manoa.
But a witness to the serving of the fake summons was suspicious and notified the authorities. Police started looking for the car.
A few hours later, a police officer spotted the vehicle on Waialae Avenue and went after it. The suspect car led the officer on a high-speed chase all the way to the entrance to Hanauma Bay, and it stopped only after the officer fired shots and forced the car to the side of the road. In the car were Thomas Massie, Grace Fortescue, Navy enlisted man Edward Lord, and the body of Joseph Kahahavai. He had been shot to death. A short time later, police arrested Albert Jones in Manoa. He still had the bogus summons in his pocket. The people in Honolulu were outraged at the killing of Kahahavai. The Navy, Washington politicians, and the mainland newspapers were outraged too. Not because a native Hawaiian had been murdered, but because a naval officer, 2 enlisted men, and a well-known socialite were charged with the crime. And there was more talk on the mainland of putting Hawaii under a military government. Grace Fortescue's wealthy friends on the mainland raised enough money to lure world-famous criminal defense lawyer Clarence Darrow out of retirement to defend her and the 3 Navy men. Thomas Massie was the only one of the 4 Darrow put on the witness stand during their trial here in the Judiciary Building. Massie told of the abduction of Kahahavai and how the young Hawaiian was taken to Grace Fortescue's house in Manoa. Massie said he held a gun on Kahahavai and finally forced the Hawaiian to confess to the beating and rape of Massie's wife. Massie claimed at that point he blacked out and could not remember pulling the trigger. Clarence Darrow's strategy was to prove that Thomas Massie was insane at that moment and was therefore not guilty of murder. That would also mean the other 3 could not be guilty of being accessories to that crime. But the jury did not agree. All 4 were convicted of manslaughter, a crime that carried a mandatory 10-year prison sentence. The outrage on the mainland reached a fever pitch, and congressional measures were prepared to take away Hawaii's civilian government. That's when President of the United States, Herbert Hoover, got personally involved. He telephoned Hawaii's governor, Lawrence Judd, and told Judd the territory would lose its self-government if the convicted killers of Joseph Kahahawai did not go free. The president wanted the governor to pardon them. Judd didn't do that. Instead, after their formal sentencing, he had them brought to his office in Iolani Palace and formally shortened their 10-year prison terms to just 1 hour to be served sitting in his office. When their brief sentences were over, the four, along with Thalia Massie, posed for a picture with Sheriff Gordon Ross. The governor later wrote about his shame at freeing them, but Hawaii's civilian government had been saved. In a few days, the Massies, Mrs. Fortescue, Lord, and Jones left for the mainland. With Thalia gone, the four surviving defendants in the rape case could not be retried, so they were legally set free. And a mainland detective agency was called in to go over the evidence and try to determine what really happened to Thalia Massie that Saturday night she went for a walk in Waikiki. The detectives in their final report said the 5 young men could not have been her attackers. There were several witnesses that had placed them at a dance in Waikiki that night, and other witnesses who saw them 20 minutes later at a house near town. There simply was not time enough for them to abduct, beat, and rape Thalia Massie. And although she obviously had suffered a beating, there was no evidence of rape. Thalia Massie had testified that before the police were notified, she had been so concerned about the possibility of venereal disease or pregnancy, she had cleansed herself, but that act also washed away what might have been evidence of a sex crime.
And the doctor who examined the undergarments she had worn that night testified that he didn't find any of the kind of evidence that might be expected had Mrs. Massie been raped by several men.
A year after they left Hawaii, Thomas and Thalia Massie were divorced. She died in 1963 of an overdose of barbiturates. It is likely she died without ever being certain about the identity of her assailants. There was one crucial bit of evidence that did not come out at the rape trial. A doctor who had been treating Thalia Massie later revealed that she suffered from a disease that had drastically reduced her vision. He said had she been attacked in broad daylight, she probably could not have identified her attackers. At night, he said, it would have been impossible. As for the murder of Joseph Kahahawai, Albert Jones later told an author who was writing a book about the Massie case that it was he, Jones, who shot the young Hawaiian, not Thomas Massie. But he said Clarence Darrow felt the only chance he had of getting them all acquitted was to portray Thomas Massie as the one who fired the shot and to claim that Massie was insane.
And after all those years, Jones said he still felt no remorse, no regret about murdering Kahahawai. And as for the murder weapon, he said Thalia Massie's sister took the gun and threw it in some quicksand at a remote beach on Oahu. The location of that beach is also still a mystery. In a moment, the story of the dancer who disappeared when Hawaii's Unsolved Mysteries continues. 1985 at Blaisdell Concert Hall. 15 days later, she taught a jazz dancing class at the Rosalie Woodson Studio in Aiea and vanished. The fact that police found her personal belongings still in the dance studio suggested that Diane had been kidnapped. Police investigated, volunteers searched, and her family and friends distributed leaflets with her picture and description. But as the weeks wore on, Diane Suzuki's father talked about waking up in the middle of the night, wondering where his daughter might be.
I can't go back to sleep thinking about her, you know. Well, what's happening to her, especially when it's raining outside. You think she's out in the rain.
The head of the police department's Criminal Investigation Division assigned a dozen detectives to the case and hoped for a break.
It's one of those situations where it could happen tonight, could happen 6 months from now, or it might never happen.
The last part of Chester Hughes' statement 3 years ago turned out to be prophetic. To this day, there has been no break in the case. Diane Suzuki is still missing. The Diane Suzuki case, at least in the beginning, was chillingly similar to the disappearance of another 19-year-old woman on Oahu just 3.5 years earlier. Her name was Lisa Au. Lisa and her boyfriend had dinner at a friend's home in Makiki. Then a few minutes before 1 a.m., January 21st, 1982, she left to drive home to Kailua alone.
We had both driven our own cars, and we had said goodnight, and that was the last I saw.
Her car was found near the entrance to Maunawili subdivision. Her purse and money were still in the vehicle, but her driver's license was missing. That led authorities to believe that Lisa Au's car had been stopped by someone she thought was a police officer. Hundreds of volunteers, including Kamehameha Marines, searched for the young woman while her parents awaited word of their daughter's fate.
We have stayed near home in case she happens to be able to call near the phone.
Putting out a plea to the person, if he still has Lisa, to, if he could please let her go.
10 days after Lisa Au disappeared, her parents' worst fears became a horrible reality. Her body was found on a brush-covered Tantalus hillside, but it was so badly decomposed the medical examiner could not determine exactly how she was killed.
There's no evidence of gunshot wounds, stab wounds, violence that would produce fractures and that sort of thing.
The medical examiner was asked if there was any evidence that she was raped.
I cannot either rule it in or out, again, because of decompositional change.
And the authorities were faced with the possibility that Lisa Au's killer was a police impersonator or even a police officer. That possibility created more fear and concern in the community than is usual in murder cases. To almost anyone who followed this tragic story more than 6 years ago, the name Lisa Au is still instantly recognizable and brings to mind the image of a pretty young woman who failed to return home one rainy winter night. The Lisa Au murder case is still unsolved. Jeff Yamashita was a Honolulu police homicide detective for 14 years. He says investigating a murder, but not being able to solve it, is frustrating.
Yes, it's very tough because as an investigator, if you're the lead investigator, you're responsible for the case. And it goes in a file unsolved, and only you know the tremendous amount of information that's there, and a lot of things aren't written down because of various reasons. And when you work the case for a long period of time, it stays in you.
But Jeff Yamashita says some unsolved murder cases are worse than others.
Some cases that I've come across, I don't even know what the motive was. And that's tougher because you really don't know why the person got killed. There's a lot of information as to probable motives, but you don't have a concrete motive, and then you don't know who did it, and that's more tough.
And there are some cases where the police cannot even prove that a crime has been committed. The case of the missing hikers went near Kaena Point, and a battered cap picked up from a trail in Kipapa Gulch were, in the beginning, the only clues to the disappearance of two ex-Marines. 28-year-old Scott Hardy and his best friend, 30-year-old Richard Blevins, went for a hike early one Saturday morning in August of 1981.
I don't even think they packed a lunch this time because Richard was asking Scott about that, and Scott said, no reason for them to. So I don't even think they took much food up, just probably a couple of bottles of water.
A few days later, Beatrice Hardy reluctantly admitted that the two men had been growing marijuana in the mountains. Volunteer rescue man Jim Gomes had discovered maps of pot patches with notations about Scott's plants and Richard's plants. At the same time, the police were picking up anonymous tips that the two men were actually pinpointing other growers' pot patches and stealing the illegal plants, and that they had been caught and killed. The search for their bodies continued until early October, ranging from Kaena Point, Waialua Dump, to a fruitless search of abandoned military storage tunnels in Kipapa Gulch. Were Hardy and Blevins murdered, their bodies perhaps tossed into the sea or buried at some secret location? Or had they, as some rumors suggested, fled from Oahu under death threats from marijuana growers? Those questions are still unanswered. In this program, we have looked at only a few of Hawaii's unsolved mysteries, and some of them will remain unsolved. Hawaiians believe that the bones of their first king should stay forever hidden. It's unlikely anyone will ever really know what happened to Thalia Massie back in September of 1931. But the more recent mysteries, the abduction and murder of Lisa Au, the disappearance of Diane Suzuki, and the case of the missing hikers, Hardy and Blevins, are different. It's almost a certainty there are people, perhaps living on this island right now, who could solve those mysteries. I'm Ray Lovell. Good night.